want me to reintroduce?
What do you think?
What?
You why don't you do that? Syndicate that. Somebody, that's helpful, but don't embarrass
Well, we've only got till 3:30 with the podium, so we're going to begin the second part of Dave Emory's lecture on the fascist implications of the Oklahoma bombing. Once again, Dave Emory.
Well, again, for people that, for the benefit of people that may be new arrivals, well, all I can say is you have my sympathies, because I'm attempting to do something that's very difficult, which is to educate people with regard to a political reality which has been deliberately obfuscated, and to do so while people are eating. So in a sense, I'm going against the grain on, again, maintaining the culinary metaphor, I'm going against the grain on two different tacks here. Before we took the break, I closed with a discussion of a very, very important aspect of Cold War history that is not generally very well known, and which in turn has profound implications leading from the immediate post-World War II period on up through the present, including, I believe, an analysis of things touching on the milieu being implicated in the Oklahoma City bombing. It also, I think, can serve as a reflection or as a barometer of American political and social reality, and something which should be very, very sobering as we look ahead from 1995 to the future. I was discussing the importation of the Reinhard Gehlen spy outfit into the or basically its attachment to the United States intelligence agencies at the end of the Second World War. Nazi Major General Reinhard Gehlen was Hitler's chief of intelligence for the Eastern Front for the Third Reich during World War II. And again, after the war, since the U.S. did not have an intelligence capability in Russia and Eastern Europe, Gehlen and his entire organization were glommed onto the fledgling CIA, where they became the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs. Now, this was Hitler's Eastern Front intelligence outfit, the supplier of intelligence on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to the Third Reich, which was simply grafted on to the CIA and did the same thing for the CIA. Later, they did the same thing for NATO. Finally, they were installed as the German intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, retaining all of its Nazi character, while they continued to supply the CIA and NATO with a vast bulk of its intelligence. In addition to the thousands of SS and Gestapo veterans who operated on behalf of U.S. intelligence, including whole elements of the Odessa network, the post-World War II SS underground headed up by Otto Skorzeny, who worked for the CIA, Hitler's commando chief. The Gehlen organization paved the way for many of these people. Again, World War II collaborators, Eastern European fascists, many of them allied with the SS. They were brought into the United States under the auspices of the Crusade for Freedom, an ill-named project, if ever there was one, an illegal domestic CIA media operation, and they were settled in the United States to become a factor in American politics. The Republican Party blamed the 1948 defeat of Thomas Dewey at the hands of Harry Truman in large measure on the alienation of Jewish voters towards the Republican Party. The Republican Party was correctly perceived as not being supportive for Israeli nationhood, which was a hot issue in the late 1940s. And in turn, the Republicans blamed the defeat of Dewey on the American Jewish communities in certain key metropolitan areas. Many of these Nazi war criminals and Third Reich collaborators were deliberately brought into the United States, illegally too, by the way, and then settled in these areas as a counterweight to Jewish electoral politics in these areas. These Third Reich collaborators and war criminals, again, many of them veterans of some of the so-called Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the German frontline troops into the Soviet Union and performed many of the liquidations of Jews and other people viewed as undesirable by the Third Reich before the technology of the gas chambers and crematoria of Auschwitz had been perfected. These elements evolved into a functioning wing of the Republican Party, which exists to this day. It's called the Republican Ethnic Heritage Council, and many of these spokespersons, again, people whose political lineage dates to the Hitler period, remain as functioning officials of the Republican Party, where they're viewed as key elements in getting out, say, the Polish, Lithuanian, and Eastern European ethnic blocs in various key American cities, Chicago, New York, and LA being three of them as examples. The Third Reich imports, to coin a term, merged with the very large and very virulent fascist and Nazi presence in the United States, which, unlike European fascism, or ostensibly unlike European fascism, which officially at least was rooted out, there were no Nuremberg trials for the American industrialists and financiers who had financed Hitler and Mussolini, who had tried to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt in 1934. There were no Nuremberg trials for people like William Dudley Pelley and the Silver Shirts, although Pelley was convicted of sedition. Again, William Dudley Pelley, an American Nazi leader in the 30s, and his Silver Shirts organization collaborated with Third Reich intelligence to try to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt and to basically establish Nazism in the United States. The pro-Nazi and pro-fascist American industrialists and financiers, generals who were of a like mind, general staff officers, and political figures who were beholden under some of the financial and industrial interests that had been pro-Nazi and pro-fascist, merged with these Third Reich imports that came into the United States, courtesy of the Reinhard Gehlen spy outfit, and also an organization which was inextricably connected with the Gehlen organization. This is an organization called the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, or the Anti-Bolshevik Nations, abbreviated ABN. This organization was simply a renaming of an organization called the Committee of Subjugated Nations. Now that's a nice sounding name. I mean, who wouldn't want to see a subjugated nation become unsubjugated and become liberated? Well, the Committee of Subjugated Nations was put together by Adolf Hitler in 1943. It was a consortium of Eastern European fascist organizations such as the Romanian Iron Guard, the Bulgarian National Front, the Croatian Ustashi, the Hungarian Arrow Cross, and various organizations from the Baltic republics, the Ukraine, and others, such as the OUN-UPA, that had been openly pro-Nazi and pro-fascist. Many of the Eastern European groups had contributed liberally to the SS killing squads that performed many of the horrors of the Third Reich. Many of them also went to work for Third Reich intelligence. These elements were formally coalesced into a political organization by Hitler in 1943. That organization was called the Committee of Subjugated Nations, and subjugated referred to countries that were occupied by Soviet troops. This organization was then renamed after World War II the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. It was reconstituted slightly, but basically it was a name change. This organization exists to this day. It is very powerful. It became a major element not only working within the Reinhard Gehlen spy outfit, but also the related elements within the Republican Party, which exists to this day. This organization had very good access to the Nixon and Ronald Reagan White House. In fact, some of the leaders of the ABN were actually invited to the White House to meet with Ronald Reagan and George Bush, where they were very openly and warmly received. Yaroslav Stetsko, for example, was formally greeted by Ronald Reagan in 1985. Maybe it was 83. Anyway, by Ronald Reagan in the mid-80s. Stetsko had been a Nazi collaborator in World War II and had attempted to set up the Ukraine as a Nazi puppet state, a satellite state of Nazi Germany. The organization that he belonged to, the OUN-UPA, actually that was the Bandera group, that was another Ukrainian fascist element, which was in the ABN, but the Stetsko people and the OUN-UPA basically contributed liberally to Waffen-SS units, some of which were frontline troops, and some of which were assigned by the Germans the tasks of the mass liquidation of Jews and other population groups. One of the tactics the Nazis utilized in World War II was the employment of non-Germans for many of the dirtiest tasks of the Third Reich. One of the mistakes that the Third Reich made early on was using frontline troops to liquidate, to carry out civilian liquidations. That demoralized some of the frontline troops. They believed that they were fighting to liquidate, to relieve the world of conspiracy by Jewish bankers and communists, and here they were shooting old men and women and children in cold blood in ditches. And some of them couldn't handle that, so it was then deemed necessary to use non-Germans who would therefore not deplete the ranks of the Wehrmacht when they began deserting or did not fight enthusiastically. The ABN is another organization to keep in mind. The Galen organization, the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, essentially just a reconstitution of Hitler's Committee of Subjugated Nations, worked together with the Republican Ethnic Heritage Council to form what basically was an overlap between the Republican Party of the United States, the residual Third Reich intelligence organization, and related political elements in Eastern Europe and parts of the former Soviet Union that had actively collaborated with Hitler. These organizations, in turn, were directly connected to U.S. military intelligence and the CIA, and some of them exist to this day within our intelligence system. The Cold War policies of the United States have been shaped to a large extent by these elements, and we should understand that they worked directly and became inextricably bound up with domestic American reactionaries and fascists. Again, some of the industrialists and financiers who had supported Hitler, some of the industrial and financial interests that had attempted to overthrow Franklin Roosevelt in 1934, with the 1934 coup attempt and the resulting investigation by the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, again, a congressional select committee that was formed to investigate a fascist coup attempt in the United States. Its results have not received a lot of dissemination because names like the DuPont family, people from the Morgan Financial Group, even Douglas MacArthur, a revered World War II hero, cropped up in the context of this investigation and in the context of active fascist collaboration and treason against the United States. These elements were dissatisfied with Franklin Roosevelt. They had been very supportive of Hitler and Mussolini for reasons that I went into in the first part of this talk. By the way, if there are people who are recent arrivals, this is being taped, and I guess the anti-fascist, what's the formal name? The Anti-Fascist Club is going to be in a position to disseminate this tape, either sell it and or show it publicly. So if you missed the first part of this talk and you're wondering what in bloody hell I'm talking about, and where are the campus medical authorities to sedate this poor creature, what you should do is contact the Anti-Fascist Club, get a hold of the tape, or arrange to contact them about when it's going to be shown publicly, and you'll be in a position to understand it. And flyers will be posted about that. The domestic American fascist elements did not go away. Rather, at the end of World War II, they combined with these Third Reich imports to form what could be literally viewed as a domestic fascist milieu, which is inextricably linked with American power politics, and which, above all else, is inextricably linked with the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. military. If people find this fantastic, just think about the general who is currently chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Shalikashvili. His father was in a unit, an Eastern European, actually a Georgian SS unit that fought against the Allies on D-Day. It fought against the American landing on D-Day. They were brought into this country in the early 1950s under the auspices of the Crusade for Freedom. John Shalikashvili was 16 or 17 at the time, and in his father's papers, which are stored at the Hoover Institute down at Stanford University, his father's enthusiasm for the Waffen-SS is made only too clear. Shalikashvili himself was almost at the age of military service when he was brought into the country. He then made the military his career. The Georgians, it should be known, were viewed by the Third Reich as the so-called Aryans of the former Soviet Union. They were viewed as the most pure racial group, or the most pure ethnic group of the former Soviet Union, and consequently were going to be the administrators of the Soviet Union on behalf of Nazi Germany and the SS after the attempted Nazi conquest of the Soviet Union. So if this sounds like something that was long ago and far away, the effects of that are very much with us, and one need look no farther than the lineage of the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It goes right back to the very phenomenon that I'm discussing. The main doctrine the main tactical doctrine of the U.S. national security establishment and the American right, including the domestic and imported fascist elements that I've been talking about. It sounds like I'm talking about beer, right? About domestic and imported. The main doctrine that they governed themselves by during the Cold War was something called rollback or liberation theory. Now, this was an approach to fighting the Cold War. This was a covert action and political warfare strategy which had been devised by the Third Reich, specifically Alfred Rosenberg, head of Hitler's Ostministerium, devising policy for Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, had espoused the tactic of recruiting the various dissident Soviet ethnic nationalities as military allies in World War II. These dissident minorities would fight on behalf of, they would be offered the chance to fight on behalf of the Third Reich, to collaborate with the Third Reich, and then in exchange, their countries, their nationalities would gain nominal independence from the Soviet Union while becoming puppet states, satellites of Nazi Germany. In this way, when this became official Third Reich policy, which it did in 1943, the alliance, the allegiance, I should say, of various Eastern European and Soviet ethnic groups was cemented to the Third Reich. The large elements of the Ukrainian, Baltic collaborators, as well as the Romanian, Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Croatian, Ustashi, and Slovakian fascists that I've alluded to, allied with the Third Reich and became incorporated, along with the Reinhard Gehlen spy outfit, into the CIA, where they became exponents of an Americanized version of rollback or liberation theory, which instead of proposing to enlist the various Soviet dissident ethnic nationalities as Third Reich collaborators, proposed to enlist the various dissident Soviet ethnic nationalities as collaborators of the United States. The common element being that they were to be used as agents, and the ultimate goal was the breakup of the Soviet Union into its constituent ethnic republics, which would then become satellite states. In the Third Reich's view, satellite states of Nazi Germany. In the Americanized version of rollback or liberation theory, they would become, quote, independent, unquote, trading partners of other European nations, as well as the United States and the Asian industrial powers. The push by the rollback or liberation theorists, and again, this was a Cold War doctrine which had its genesis with Alfred Rosenberg's Ostministerium, and which became a major tenet of American political doctrine as a result of the Crusade for Freedom. That's this totally illegal domestic CIA media operation that I alluded to earlier. It was created by Allen Dulles. Richard Nixon was one of its top operatives. Ronald Reagan and William Casey worked for it. It not only brought many of these Nazi and Eastern European collaborators into the United States to function as a political counterweight to American liberalism, it also made rollback or liberation theory the official espoused policy of the Republican Party. The rollback or liberation milieu remained very, very disappointed, though, by the performance of the American government. In particular, the rollback or liberation milieu and the forces of Joe McCarthy, Senator Joseph McCarthy, whose anti-communist witch hunts were inextricably connected with the political milieu that I'm talking about, just as Joe McCarthy has been misrepresented as a political aberration, as kind of a loose cannon who got out of hand. Rather, Joe McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy, and his anti-communist witch hunts of the early 50s, which transformed the American political landscape, it was not an aberration. McCarthy's two main financial backers were Frank Sensenbrenner and Joseph Harnischfeger, Alfred Harnischfeger and Frank Sensenbrenner, two German-American industrialists from Wisconsin. Sensenbrenner's main industrial undertaking was the Kimberly-Clark Corporation, whose best-known product is Kleenex, which people are no doubt familiar with. WH Industries of Walter Harnischfeger. Maybe you've seen some of these giant road-building machines, these great big sort of rectangular asphalt-laying machines that build highways. Those are manufactured by WH Industries, and those are probably the best known of its heavy industrial products. Anyway, both Sensenbrenner and Harnischfeger were openly pro-Hitler. Sensenbrenner had a watch that was an autographed watch from Adolf Hitler that he was very proud of. They were openly pro-Hitler. Joe McCarthy actually attempted in 1949 to derail Senate hearings into the Malmedy Massacre, a massacre of American POWs conducted by the SS at the Battle of the Bulge. He attacked the American survivors of the massacre as, quote, 39ers, unquote, meaning German Jews who came to the United States in 1939, and claimed that they were defaming our German allies, because this was already in the Cold War period. Although Dwight Eisenhower had officially endorsed rollback or liberation theory as a doctrine, in fact, in practice, he was an adherent of the more moderate containment doctrine that had been formed by George Kennan, a Truman staffer, basically one of the key formulators of Harry Truman's foreign policy. It was interesting to watch the operations of Joe McCarthy, however, as the Senate was conducting hearings into the State Department nominations that Dwight Eisenhower had put before the Senate. Joe McCarthy attempted to have many of them disqualified, some of them successfully, by labeling them as communist agents or communist sympathizers or de facto collaborators, in order to provide the information or disinformation, which is really what it was, that was used to discredit the Eisenhower State Department appointees. He was relying, Joe McCarthy that is, was relying exclusively on intelligence being provided by a former military intelligence man named John Frenchy Grombach, G-R-O-M-B-A-C-H. Grombach was a military intelligence officer who in turn was getting his information from an SS intelligence network headed up by SS General Karl Wolff, who was Himmler's personal adjutant during World War II. He had a post-World War II SS intelligence organization, and all of Joe McCarthy's intelligence that he was using to discredit Eisenhower State Department appointees came from this Karl Wolff SS intelligence outfit that was feeding the information first to Grombach, and then through Grombach to Joe McCarthy. Nonetheless, though, Dwight Eisenhower in practice remained an adherent of containment rather than rollback theory. He recognized the territorial integrity of the former Soviet Union, and then when John Kennedy was elected under what was basically a relatively militant Cold War posture, the rollback or liberation milieu became increasingly disenchanted with liberal democratic politics and with the democratic process itself. Now, the subject of the assassination of President Kennedy, as well as America's other political assassinations, many of which can be demonstrably linked to the elements that killed President Kennedy, is subject for a lecture in and of itself. Perhaps during the question and answer session I can name some tape cassettes. I can give you the name and address of a tape duplication service which has tape cassettes available setting forth the documentation for all of the things I'm talking about. But suffice it to say that the elements who were frustrated by Dwight Eisenhower were totally embittered by many of the things that John Kennedy did, both in the domestic and the area of domestic policy, and also in the area of foreign and national security policy. This milieu, this conglomeration, this alliance of domestic and imported reactionary elements, many of them explicitly pro-Nazi and pro-fascist, or actually elements that had collaborated with the Third Reich, were even more disenchanted with John Kennedy than they were with Dwight Eisenhower, and they were very disenchanted with Dwight Eisenhower. They hated Kennedy for not providing air support for the Bay of Pigs invasion. They hated Kennedy for not invading or bombing Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, which the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to do, by the way. It's interesting that now, within the last couple of years, it has come out that the Soviets had a combat-equipped brigade in Cuba, fully equipped with tactical nuclear weapons, and they were instructed to use them. If the United States had done what John Kennedy refused to allow them to do, there would have been a nuclear war. We wouldn't be sitting here now because the Soviets had indicated that they had a large stock of tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. They were going to use them if the United States invaded. Then Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, was asked what would have happened if the Soviets had used tactical nuclear weapons on an American invasion force in Cuba. And she says flat out, we would have launched all of our missiles and sent all our bombers, we would have wiped the Soviet Union out. Of course, there would have been a retaliatory strike, not to mention all of the fallout. We wouldn't be here right now. Proof of the wisdom of restraint in dangerous situations, if ever there was. However, that and many other things absolutely infuriated the American right, including the explicitly fascist and Nazi elements that I've already alluded to. They were even more incensed when John Kennedy in 1962 proposed joint space exploration with the Soviet Union, when he took his initial steps to withdraw the United States from the Vietnam War, which he did. In fact, in October of 1963, Kennedy had issued a document calling for a secret phased withdrawal of all U.S. troops from Vietnam by Christmas of 1965. Kennedy had opened a secret backdoor diplomatic channel to Fidel Castro to normalize relations with Cuba. Castro, like Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, although a Marxist, was primarily a nationalist, and being no fool, saw that the best interests of Cuba lay in a non-hostile and relatively friendly long-term relationship with the giant power to its north. So Castro and Kennedy had worked out a tentative agreement. Kennedy was going to take credit, or take responsibility, I should say, on behalf of the United States for the brutal dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba, and in turn, Fidel Castro was going to move away from the international communists in his own circle of advisors, chiefly Che Guevara, and was going to move away from the Soviet Union. In turn, both nations were going to normalize relations, both diplomatic and trade relations, and begin assuming a more normal footing. That was absolute treason to the anti-communists, to the CIA, to the anti-Castro Cubans, not to mention this Galen rollback or liberation milieu. In August of 1963, a few months before he was killed, Kennedy concluded the first substantive arms limitation agreement with the Soviet Union, the Nuclear Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty. He also took a number of steps on the domestic front, which absolutely infuriated the forces of political reaction. His support for the civil rights movement absolutely infuriated the American right. Many other things he did also made them livid. To make a very long story very short, by the early 1960s, the rollback or liberation milieu, this milieu involving economic or industrial, financial, political, and national security figures, an explicitly fascist milieu, many of whose members had come into the United States courtesy of the Third Reich's intelligence services and related elements, had come to the same conclusion about American democracy that the Freikorps and the Einwohnerwehr and the Zeitfreiwilligen the military organizations that were put together in the Weimar Republic had come to about the Weimar Republic itself. These organizations, again composed of World War I military veterans, were put together by the Weimar Republic to suppress the communist revolution in Weimar Germany after World War I. They did that, but then remained intact, largely illegally and underground, in order to subvert the democracy of the Weimar Republic, which they viewed as soft on communism. They were livid at the Weimar Republic not only for signing the Versailles Treaty, which they viewed as humiliating to German national interests, but beyond that, they felt that democracy and the relatively liberal policies of the Weimar Republic were paving the way for the communists to take over Germany. And so they felt in order to prevent a communist takeover of Germany, it was necessary to eliminate the Democrats with a small d in Germany. The resulting assassination program paved the way for Hitler's rise to power by eliminating the progressive political leadership of Weimar Germany, ranging from doctrinaire Marxists, like, again, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who had led the abortive German Revolution, right on up through conservative social democrats like Foreign Minister Walter von Rathenau, who concluded the Treaty of Friendship with the Soviet Union. An analogous decision and an analogous policy was made by this rollback or liberation milieu. They concluded that the ballot was not going to work for them. Dewey had been defeated in 1948, and then Eisenhower had reneged on his promise in 1952 to roll back communism and to break up the Soviet Union. It was therefore deemed necessary by these elements in order to save America and the world from, quote, communism, unquote, which they equated with democracy, to engage in the same kinds of covert operations, the same type of exercise of deadly force here in the United States, which they had already been engaging in various countries during the course of the Cold War. The U.S. intelligence agencies have overthrown numerous countries in the Cold War period, Iran, Guatemala being just two examples of countries that had elected governments that were viewed as unsatisfactory to the United States, which then promptly overthrew them. There have been many others since. One of the bloodiest was in Indonesia, where virtually all of the ethnic Chinese were slaughtered by the Suharto government, put in power by a CIA-financed and inspired coup. By most accounts, some 800,000 ethnic Chinese were slaughtered in the wake of that particular coup. It was deemed necessary by this rollback or liberation milieu to use violent force to eliminate their political opposition in the United States. That is why, as I noted in the last part of the lecture before we took a break, that when one takes a look at what happened to the progressive political leadership of the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, when one steps back and looks at it, it's fairly clear what was going on. John Kennedy shot to death, Robert Kennedy shot to death, Martin Luther King shot to death, Malcolm X shot to death, members of the Black Panther Party, a radical left-wing organization, shot to death, Malcolm X shot to death, George Moscone and Harvey Milk. George Moscone, the liberal mayor of San Francisco, Harvey Milk, the first openly gay city councilman, shot to death. Leo Ryan, the liberal congressman from San Mateo County, shot to death. George Jackson, the Soledad, George Jackson and Jonathan Jackson, two of the so-called Soledad brothers, shot to death. Faye Stender, George Jackson's attorney, shot and crippled by 5 bullets fired at point-blank range from an assailant. She supposedly committed suicide after being wheelchair-bound. Other people have died under somewhat more ambiguous circumstances. Still, I don't think you have to be Columbo or Sherlock Holmes to look a little bit beyond the immediate official circumstances of these crimes and to recognize that there, as Hamlet said, was something rotten in Denmark. And indeed, here in that Denmark known as the United States, something very rotten indeed has evolved. At the core of the milieu, which dispatched the Kennedys, Martin Luther King, and a great many other people, was this fascist consortium that I have alluded to. The Reinhard Gehlen spy outfit and its related elements, the Ethnic Heritage Council within the Republican Party, and the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, first became known to me when I came across this milieu at the operational level in my studies of the assassination of President Kennedy. The official version of John Kennedy's assassination is not only wrong, it's physically impossible in all of its major manifestations. Even the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s, a badly compromised investigation, found that there had certainly been a conspiracy behind President Kennedy's assassination and concluded that, among other things, the U.S. Department of Justice should begin investigating David Ferry and the anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans. That is who Jim Garrison was after in his investigation in New Orleans, the New Orleans district attorney, who has been defamed in the most extravagant fashion for his efforts. Garrison had a hold of a major part of the conspiracy, and in fact, as he began investigating it, he began coming across these Third Reich alumni who had been brought into the United States and were working with our intelligence system. They had hooked up with elements of the military, elements of the intelligence system, and political and industrial figures who were of a fascist bent, and had formed an effective operating fascist milieu within the United States. One of the elements of that milieu were the so-called Patriot networks, which, according to an American fascist named Joseph Adams Miltier, had infiltrated the, quote, Fair Play for Cuba Committee, unquote, in the New Orleans area, and had tarred Lee Harvey Oswald as a communist and made it appear that, as he put it, that basically, quote, the commies killed Kennedy. Miltier, who died under strange circumstances in 1974, like a great many people who had pertinent information about the Kennedy assassination, he was killed when a lantern that he was trying to light exploded, and he suffered fatal burns. He said on his deathbed to an acquaintance from the intelligence community that he felt he had been set up. He did not think that explosion was a natural occurrence. In Miltier, in discussions with undercover informants from various police departments, primarily in Miami, revealed parts of the Kennedy assassination plot ahead of time. Later, he boasted to some of these same undercover law enforcement operatives that Kennedy had been killed by, quote, an international underground, unquote. I think that term is appropriate up to a point, but only up to a point. Some elements of that international fascist milieu were indeed underground, such as the elements associated with the Odessa, the post-World War II SS underground, which has functioned very effectively right on up to the present period, although obviously some of its original operatives are getting quite old at this point. That's something which is viewed as the stuff of pulp fiction, yet it's very, very real. However, many of the elements of this underground were not in fact underground at all. They were not particularly well recognized because of the control of our media and educational process, which has been effected in such a way as to keep many of these elements out of sight of the American public. Yet the fact of the matter is, things like the Reinhard Gehlen Spy Organization, the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, the Republican Ethnic Heritage Council, these are not underground organizations at all. They are above ground, albeit ones that are not particularly well recognized by most people in this society. These are the elements that conspired successfully to assassinate John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and a great many other people. It was a mixture of, again, to use a beer metaphor, domestic and imported fascists. With domestic fascists who had hated Franklin Roosevelt and sought his overthrow, not just so-called street Nazis, white supremacists, and Ku Klux Klansmen, but also powerful industrial and financial figures who thought that Roosevelt was a, quote, traitor to his class and liked the doctrinaire anti-communism and anti-labor stance of fascism and Nazism. And one of the elements that was utilized in some aspects of the Kennedy assassination at the operational level were, on the one hand, some of these Eastern European spy networks and Nazi and fascist collaborators associated with Gehlen and ABN, and also some of the so-called patriot networks. Now, the term patriot organizations is one which will establish a resonance, certainly, for people in 1995. I want to reiterate something I stated at the beginning of this discussion when I said, perversely, in a sense, I'm going to begin with the ending. There has been no legal finding of fact in connection with the Oklahoma City bombing. There has been no conviction of John McVeigh or Mr. Nichols or anybody else. It does appear, however, that elements of the paramilitary right, elements of the militia networks are involved, and associates of these networks are involved at some level with this particular incident. The paramilitary right overlaps with the intelligence services and the military. They're by no means coterminous, but the paramilitary right has been utilized by the intelligence services to recruit mercenaries for work in various third world countries on behalf of CIA. Rhodesia in the 1970s, now the independent nation of Zimbabwe, was a country which saw widespread use of white supremacist mercenaries on behalf of CIA. The evidence suggests at this point that if in fact McVeigh and Nichols were involved in the Oklahoma City bombing, they were involved as relatively low-level operatives of more powerful and as yet unrevealed elements. As I indicated at the beginning of this talk, it is wrong to talk about the government as possibly behind this or the right wing as behind this, because there are elements of the government that look for the subversion of democracy and that operate against the democratic foundation of government itself, such as this rollback or liberation milieu that I've been talking about. And there are elements of the paramilitary right, the elements of the right wing that work with the government. In the background of what we're seeing in Oklahoma City are certainly elements of the paramilitary right, which are working hand in glove with explicitly fascist elements. The Michigan militia that has been linked journalistically to the people that have been charged with the bombing actually was interfacing with German neo-Nazis. Some members of not only the Michigan militia, but others of these militia groups traveled to Germany to not only undergo ideological exchanges, but also military training with German Nazi groups. And in turn, as I said, Ewald Altans, a prominent German neo-Nazi leader, traveled to Michigan to meet with the leaders of the Michigan militia. Ewald Altans had been groomed for his position as a top German neo-Nazi leader by none other than Otto Ernst Rehmer. Now again, Otto Ernst Rehmer was a member of the Liebstandarte Adolf Hitler. That was Hitler's personal SS regiment and one of the most feared units of the SS. Rehmer personally supervised the execution of the July 1944 conspirators who had attempted to assassinate Adolf Hitler. So there is actually a direct and demonstrable element of political continuity between elements of this militia milieu and the Nazism and fascism of the Third Reich. At the same time, I think that the physical evidence suggests the distinct possibility, and please note very carefully my use of the word possibility, that elements of our intelligence system and or law enforcement agencies may have been aware of or even perhaps conspiring actively with some of these same elements. We know from history that elements of the paramilitary right do work with the most reactionary elements of our national security establishment and intelligence system. They have done so in regard to the assassination of President Kennedy, various covert operations ranging from Operation 40 and Operation Mongoose, CIA-supervised guerrilla warfare campaigns against Fidel Castro, right on up through, say, for example, the Rhodesian campaign of the mid-1970s. Other fascist mercenaries were recruited to fight on behalf of CIA in Angola as well. When we consider the possibility of government elements being involved with the Oklahoma bombing, and again, I'm not accusing the government as a whole of doing this. As I've indicated, it is a mistake to view the government as a unified entity. There are elements of the government that work at cross purposes, and there are many, many people within our armed services and intelligence agencies and police agencies who would find the notion of setting off an incident like Oklahoma City genuinely horrifying, and would do everything in their power to prevent something like that. All right, we're going to take a break just to switch microphones before we continue. Rush Limbaugh on his radio show a couple of weeks ago, which I view as a great endorsement. As far as I'm concerned, Rush Limbaugh is essentially Hermann Goering in drag. And, I view it as a great compliment to be attacked by him. Comedian Mark Russell was talking about Limbaugh, and he was comparing Limbaugh with the Hindenburg, the Nazi dirigible that exploded in 1937. He said, but on second thought, it's unfair to compare a flaming Nazi gas bag with a magnificent airship, which I thought was an appropriate discussion. But if Limbaugh is going off in my direction, I must be doing something right. But I'm talking about, again, by way of resuming the thread of the discussion, I'm talking about some political and historical phenomena which, of necessity, I am going to have to deal with in abbreviated fashion due to the limitations of time. When talking about the covert history of fascism and the covert operations of our national security establishment in the post-World War II period, we are talking about things not only, things many of which remain classified officially to this day, but things which have been deliberately hidden from public view. Yet, if one takes the time to do political research, these things are really quite apparent upon reflection and upon that research. I've glossed over America's political assassinations very quickly. Each of those would be the subject of a lecture in and of themselves, and in fact I have given lectures about each of America's political assassinations and done archive tapes about them. I will again mention a source where you can get some of the information on these assassinations. Again, I came into what I term anti-fascist research as a result of my studies into my research into the assassination of President Kennedy. And what I came across at the operation level were many of these Third Reich Eastern European collaborators who had worked for the Gehlen spy outfit in World War II and had then jumped to the CIA. For example, when Lee Harvey Oswald, the patsy for the Kennedy assassination, and himself almost certainly a left-cover U.S. intelligence operative who was first infiltrated in the Soviet Union to make him appear like a Marxist traitor. Then he was infiltrated into various leftist organizations in the United States. For example, he was the sole member of the New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a pro-Castro activist organization, which shared basically an office building, an office space, with a New Orleans organization that was an anti-Castro CIA-sponsored outfit. Not a very likely possibility if one considers that in its strategic ramifications. The handling of Lee Harvey Oswald, probably when he was in the Soviet Union, and certainly when he came to the United States and to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, was being accomplished by people associated with the Gehlen spy outfit, the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, and this intelligence fascist milieu that I've been talking about. For example, when the Oswalds first came back to the United States, And again, remember, Oswald supposedly had defected to the Soviet Union, giving them top secret information about our radar nets and the U-2 spy plane. That is treason, folks, and not something that in early 1960s America would have been regarded casually. He was never prosecuted for a crime, never charged with a crime. Instead, he was met upon disembarking by a guy named Spaz Rakin, who was head of the American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, and himself a Bulgarian fascist and veteran of the Bulgarian National Front that had collaborated with Hitler. One of Oswald's handlers in the Dallas-Fort Worth area was a guy named George de Mohrenschildt, nay George von Mohrenschildt. He was a white Russian whose father had managed the Baku oil fields for the Nobel family in Tsarist Russia. He then had spied for Nazi Germany during World War II, was arrested at one point by the FBI for spying on the Aransas Pass, Texas Coast Guard station, which was deeply involved with anti-U-boat activity in the Gulf of Mexico during, I was about to say the Persian Gulf, that's a different Gulf, the Gulf of Mexico in World War II. Other handlers of the Oswalds were people associated with the OUN-UPA, the Ukrainian fascist collaborationist organization that became part of the Galen organization, part of the ABN. They had very welcome entrance to the Reagan and Nixon White Houses. One of the people associated with one of the OUN-UPA organizations in describing George de Mohrenschildt. Now bear in mind, this was a guy who had spied for Nazi Germany in World War II. He was very close, he worked for a time with a guy named Baron Konstantin Maydell, who at one point was in charge of the Abwehr in North America. The Abwehr was German military intelligence during World War II, and Maydell was in charge of its North American activities for a period of time while working with George de Mohrenschildt, who then went to work for U.S. intelligence after World War II, in all probability. In describing him, another of the Oswald's handlers, a fellow named Igor Voshinin, who, by the way, is one of one of several white Russians who handled the Oswalds in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. Voshinin described George de Mohrenschildt in the same breath as an Eisenhower Republican and a leftist, which will give you an idea of just how far to the right these people were. This is one ripe bunch of fruit, I'll tell you right now. Another of the white Russian handlers of the Oswalds in the immediate aftermath of the assassination was a white Russian fascist named Ilya Mamantov, M-A-M-A-N-T-O-V, who also was a very good personal friend of George Bush, by the way, and who in a letter to George Bush concluded with the as yet undeciphered and rather cryptic statement that, quote, actually this is a letter from Bush to Mamantov, excuse me, I'll correct myself. He concluded this particular letter shown to a researcher after Mamontov's death by saying, quote, "You and I did it," unquote. George Bush's name, like the names of all of the other presidents since John Kennedy, with the exception of Clinton and Carter, crop up in one context or another in the course of the investigation into the assassination of John Kennedy. Richard Nixon, for example, was in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963 as a lawyer for PepsiCo. He flew out about an hour and a half before Kennedy was killed. Yet when the FBI interviewed him on February 28th of 1964, Nixon testified that he had left Dallas on November 20th of 1963, a full 2 days before he actually left, despite the fact that the New York Times had an interview with Nixon in Dallas on November 21st in its November 22nd edition. It's said that everyone who was of the age of consciousness when Kennedy was killed remembers exactly where he or she was when they heard. This apparently did not include Richard Nixon, who was defeated by John Kennedy in 1960, who just happened to be in Dallas, Texas, at the same time as John Kennedy was getting his brains blown out, but then lied to the FBI 3 months later, claiming he left on November 20th. There are many, many connections between Watergate and the assassination of President Kennedy. In fact, it appears that Nixon was deliberately ousted by elements that were hostile to him within the intelligence community, using Nixon's participation in the Kennedy assassination and many of the people from the Nixon White House's participation in the Kennedy assassination as leverage to force Nixon to resign. We haven't got time to go into it here, But when one examines the cast of characters from Watergate, it is the same cast of characters from the assassination of John Kennedy. In fact, H.R. Haldeman, one of Nixon's aides who recently and mercifully passed away, noted in his book, The Ends of Power, that when Richard Nixon spoke about, quote, the whole Bay of Pigs thing, unquote, and it was his anxiety, Nixon's anxiety, that, quote, the whole Bay of Pigs thing, unquote, might come out if he released the Watergate tapes to the Watergate special prosecutor, then it was stated by Haldeman that this was recognized to be a code word inside of the Nixon White House for the assassination of President Kennedy. There are many other connections between the assassination as well. And other presidents, Ronald Reagan helped to block Jim Garrison's investigation in New Orleans by refusing to extradite an American reactionary named Edgar Eugene Bradley to New Orleans. Then Deputy State Attorney General Charles A. O'Brien reviewed the Garrison extradition request, recommended that it be granted. The day-to-day handling of the Garrison extradition request was handled by Ed Meese, then Reagan's legal counselor, subsequently Attorney General of the United States under Ronald Reagan, who waited until after Richard Nixon was elected president and then turned it down without comment. George Bush's name crops up in connection with the assassination of President Kennedy in a number of different contexts. He was deeply involved with the White Russian Galen Nazi milieu that was handling the Oswalds, good personal friend of George de Mohrenschildt, the former White Russian and Nazi spy that I spoke about earlier, good friend of Ilya Mamantov, the former White Russian and Nazi spy I spoke about earlier, and Bush's name crops up in connection with a number of different contexts. In connection with the assassination of John Kennedy, Gerald Ford, who succeeded Richard Nixon, was a member of the Warren Commission and the Warren Commission liaison between the FBI. He appointed George Bush as CIA director. George Bush was head of the Republican National Committee during Watergate. He appointed George Bush as director of the CIA when the House Select Committee was formed, and Bush was less than forthcoming in his cooperation with the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Ronald Reagan later served on the Rockefeller Commission, investigating possible CIA participation in the assassination of John Kennedy. They found that there was none. In fact, there was. It is a common misconception that the CIA killed President Kennedy. No, the orders did not come from Langley. They came from, unfortunately, much higher than Langley. And there were some elements of the CIA that were involved in the operational level, but these were elements of the CIA that fell to the right of the CIA as a whole, whom they considered to be basically a bunch of commie simps and a bunch of sissies. Bear in mind, again, the Mamantov comment that George de Mohrenschildt, a White Russian Nazi spy and a CIA operative, was a, quote, and we mentioned him in the same breath as an Eisenhower Republican and a leftist. That'll give you an idea of how, when I talk about this fascist milieu, when I talk about their explicit fascist and Nazi underpinnings and sympathies, I'm not speaking figuratively. These are people who are Nazis and fascists in their outlook, and many of them in their practice, and they would view an Eisenhower Republican as a leftist. The milieu that gained control of this country's political process through the use of the same kind of covert operation and deadly force that had long been used by our intelligence services abroad is the milieu that is in charge of this country today. And again, I'm skipping around a little bit here. There has been no conviction in connection with the Oklahoma City bombing. Yet the elements that are cropping up in connection with the investigation are elements of the paramilitary right and the so-called Patriot networks that have long functioned in conjunction with elements of our intelligence system. It is a matter of public record that they have operational connections to Nazi elements both in the United States and in Germany, such as Ewald Altons, a protege of Hitler bodyguard Otto Ernst Rehmer. And at the same time, I think it's quite clear that if, in fact, John McVeigh and Mr. Nichols were involved, as they are alleged to have been, that they were involved as relatively low-level operatives of more powerful elements. It seems unlikely to me that McVeigh and Nichols could have pulled this off by themselves. The logistical support that they would have required, the intelligence that they would have needed in order to pick the target, not only an area where there would have been federal agents, but a building that would have been particularly susceptible to the explosive and the application of explosives that was used. And the Oklahoma City building was very, very susceptible because of the way it was constructed. These suggest abilities beyond what Mr. McVeigh and Mr. Nichols could have pulled off. I would note that McVeigh and Nichols hooked up when they were buddies in the United States Army. I would also note that Mark Kornke, so-called Mark from Michigan, the leader of the Michigan militia, is a veteran of military intelligence. Bear in mind how Adolf Hitler got his start, as an undercover operative for military intelligence. The German Nazi Party, in its inception, was a front for the political department of the Reichswehr, the German army. And there were elements, very powerful elements, of the German military that were conspiring actively with supposedly demobilized veterans to overthrow the Weimar Republic. We have seen a similar pattern of collaboration between elements of the military and elements of the paramilitary right in the United States in the Cold War period. And in turn, there is a very frightening degree of political continuity from the supposedly respectable and the supposedly mainstream Republican Party, which has been very vociferous in attempting to dissociate itself from the Oklahoma City bombing at the same time as not only the Republican political leadership, but also people like Rush Limbaugh, G. Gordon Liddy, the convicted Watergate felon. He's an interesting person, by the way, to understand just how sick our political intellectual culture has become. We have talk show hosts, Gordon Liddy and Oliver North, both of whom used their positions as officials of the United States government to commit unlawful acts and were convicted of same, although later Oliver North's convictions were overturned on appeal. It's very interesting to see these people as spokespersons against the unwarranted use of governmental power. If that isn't a case of appointing a fox to guard the chicken house, I don't know what is. But it's very interesting to watch at the same time the right wing in the Republican Party, which are basically one and the same these days, attempting to dissociate themselves from Oklahoma City while endorsing many of the outlooks of the militias. And I should say that I support some of the same things as some of the militias. I'm opposed to gun control, which is not going to solve crime. Crime is produced by socioeconomic problems. And some of the things that the militias talk about are accurate. There are, for example, martial law contingency plans that have been drawn up to be put into effect in the event of any one of a number of constituencies. This came out during the Iran-Contra hearings, although it was put together by Oliver North and company, working for the National Security Council, the very Oliver North who now is standing up for some of these very same elements who are allegedly opposed to the very martial law that Oliver North helped to set up the plans for. I would note that there are a number of things about the Michigan bombing that do not add up. I'm not going to get into the fine points of the minutiae of the investigating, but there are many things suggesting that this was in fact a government operation, perhaps planned in advance. The degree of cooperation between federal agencies is one thing that has been noted. Army Times, among other publications, and put out by the U.S. Army, has said that the collaboration between government agencies was such that it almost appears to have been planned in advance. Beyond that, an interesting detail was carried in an interview with one of the persons at the Ryder Truck Rental Company that rented McVeigh the truck, and also John Doe No. 2, the truck, which was allegedly used to carry the explosives to Oklahoma City. They said, well, we didn't even ask for their driver's license. We didn't ask for their driver's licenses. They just seemed like nice guys. I defy anybody here to go rent a truck or a car from a rental agency and not be required to present a credit card as well as a driver's license. They weren't even asked for driver's licenses. You go to the heartland, I don't care if it's Missouri, Kansas, anyplace else, and try to rent a car or a truck for to be driven to another state, by the way, and not show a driver's license. You will not be allowed to do it. I don't know who pulled the strings in Oklahoma City, but I suspect that it is again, some of the pro-Nazi elements within both, on the one hand, at the operational level, the paramilitary right, and at the executive level, elements of the national security establishment and the government itself. I think what we are looking at, and again, this is speculative, and I want to distinguish that from established research, that what we are looking at is something which is very closely analogous to the functioning of the so-called Black Reichswehr, or the Freikorps in Weimar, Germany. Underground paramilitary units loyal to German imperialism and to fascism, not to the Republic, which they were ostensibly put together to support, and in fact conspiring actively to use deadly force to overthrow that Republic. I would note in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing, there has been draconian legislation introduced and actual measures introduced to greatly expand police and surveillance power and drastically curtail people's civil liberties in order to combat the terrorist menace. The FBI is being unleashed to check people for hemorrhoids in the name of counterterrorism. A virulent LAPD unit, which had been greatly reined in the early 1980s for conducting political espionage on people. This was in a unit of the LAPD, the PDID, the Public Disorder and Intelligence Division, an anti-terrorist unit of the Los Angeles Police Department, which was the focus of a lawsuit by the ACLU and a number of citizens in the LA area, because some of its members had been using their responsibilities as active duty members of the LAPD to carry out political espionage. They were spying on people, not people who were criminals, or who even had criminal records, but people with whose politics they disagreed. And the information was then being given to a right-wing think tank and private intelligence agency called Western Goals, who in turn was transferring the information to a matching data bank in Germany, a matching database in Germany. This was an espionage operation being conducted on American citizens, but the results were being stored in Germany. If people find some of the things that I talk about incredible, what have you, I can understand that. Again, just imagine if I were discussing the solar system and the universe in the 16th century. If I proposed to you that the Earth revolved around the sun and the Earth was round, you would say that I was not only nuts, but a heretic, and I would be burned for my trouble, because the prevailing view was that the Earth was flat, and that the sun, the moon, and the stars all revolved around it, because this is the way it appeared. Eventually, that was disproved. Many of the illusions that continue to be held in our political and intellectual culture are analogous in that respect, except that these were deliberately created and perpetuated. That is perhaps the only major difference. I would also note, in connection with the Oklahoma City bombing, that there are some superficial similarities between the effects that that bombing may have and the Reichstag fire in Germany. Again, bear in mind the Reichstag fire, the burning of the German parliament, which was an act of terrorism performed by the German Nazi Party, but blamed on the communists and used as an excuse for suspending democratic process in the then Nazi Germany. Hitler achieved dictatorial emergency powers. It was said that we need to suspend democratic process and increase police and surveillance powers in order to combat this terrorist menace, this communist menace which has burned the Reichstag building. And in fact, that was used by the Nazis, that terrorist incident, a provocation, was used as a justification for a preordained political agenda of repression and terror. I think in the substance of some of the summary steps that have already been taken by executive order or by the actions of municipal and state police agencies, and perhaps in some of the legislation that is now up before Congress, we can see at least a partial recapitulation of the curtailment and or possibly elimination of civil liberties and democratic process in this country in order to combat this terrorist menace. And again, I want to stress a couple of points that I've made several times already in the 2.5 hours, now almost 3 hours that I've been doing this. I've been, in a sense, attempting to do the impossible. I've been summing up several decades of power political history, much of it deliberately kept hidden from people in a relatively short period of time. Believe me, the documentation for these things exists, and I'd be more than happy during the question and answer session to cite people some relevant sources. A current book called The Secret War Against the Jews, subtitled How Western Espionage Betrayed the Jewish People, by John Loftus, a former career military officer and Justice Department investigator with a very, very high security clearance, drawn largely on people in the intelligence community who would finally come forward and say, hey, listen, you know, you better be aware that some of this stuff is going on, and that basically there's trouble in River City. There are a number of plenty of other sources available for this information, but granted the fact that a lot of these sources are relatively obscure, rare, and sources that, frankly, the powers that be do not want you to know about, it is not surprising that much of what I say will sound strange to the uninitiated listener, and that's not meant in any way to be patronizing or condescending. Two, because of the scope of what I've been talking about, I've had to telescope some very, very complex and very significant elements into a relatively short period of time. I feel very self-conscious discussing, for example, this country's political assassinations, including and especially the assassination of President Kennedy, a consummately important event and a very complex event, and one which I could easily fill up a full 3 hours of discussion just focusing on that. To describe that in just a matter of a few minutes is necessarily to do injustice to the intellectual substance of that particular event, but it is important, and yet in order to cover the ground that I've had to cover, I've had to gloss over some things much more quickly than I otherwise would have done. I also want to stress, too, that some of the things that I have said with regard to Oklahoma City are speculative. I think that there is very firm ground to base that speculation upon, and I suspect that that speculation in time, if the truth comes out, will be found to be fact. But as yet, some of my ruminations about the military background of McVeigh and Nichols, the military intelligence background of Mark from Michigan, and my speculations concerning superficial and perhaps very close similarities between some of these militias and the Freikorps, the so-called Black Reichswehr in Weimar Germany, some of my comparisons between the functioning of the intelligence community in the United States in the Cold War period and the genesis of the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler in Germany. Bear in mind again for recent arrivals that Hitler got his start as a political animal, as an undercover operative for German military intelligence, specifically infiltrating organizations as an undercover operative for the political department of the Reichswehr, the German army between the wars, and that the overthrow of the Weimar Republic was accomplished largely as a result of a deliberate program of political violence, assassination, and terror that was conducted by underground units of the German army, supposedly demobilized but utilizing dissatisfied World War I veterans and active duty officers with the German military who viewed the very government they were supposed to uphold as subversive, as soft on communism, and as inimical to Germany's interests. The active revolutionaries, the ones who were viewed as the ones who would take up the gun against the Weimar Republic, were called National Bolsheviks in Weimar Germany. This has nothing to do, by the way, with communism or the Soviet Union or Bolsheviks. They were called National Bolsheviks as the Nazis were termed National Socialists. You know, these were extreme right-wing fascist activists. They, in turn, were the most virulent element, the most polarized and the most activist element of a broader and more effectively documented and, quote, respectable, unquote, political phenomenon in Weimar Germany called the Konservative Revolution, or conservative revolution. These were German conservatives who certainly would not conspire actively to overthrow the Weimar Republic. They certainly would not conspire against Germany. However, they certainly didn't like the Weimar Republic, and they wanted it replaced by a more activist and more reactionary regime. It is a matter of public record that, in fact, the Konservative Revolution and its more respectable advocates were directly connected to the National Bolsheviks and the assassins and terrorists of the Freikorps and the Black Reichswehr. So today, I think there is a demonstrable connection, and I think the analogy is valid, though not necessarily complete, between the militias, these paramilitary units, some of which in all probability are working for some elements of the government. There are documented connections between many of these groups and white supremacist and Nazi groups, not only here, but in Germany, and in the case of Ewald Altans and Otto Ernst Kramer, actual elements of demonstrable political continuity between some of the fascist and Nazi elements in these militias and the fascism and Nazism of the Hitler and Third Reich period. So too, I think, the so-called conservative revolution of people like Newt Gingrich, Bob Dole, Phil Graham, and their related talk show hosts, G. Gordon Liddy, Rush Limbaugh, I think that they, in turn, are directly connected to the militias. And I think the comparison between the Konservative Revolution in Weimar Germany and the National Bolsheviks, the right-wing extremists and armed terrorists who systematically used violent force to eliminate democracy in Germany in the Weimar period, which paved the way for the rise of Hitler. I think so too the militias and the paramilitary right-wing in this country could be viewed as a direct extension of the conservative revolution of Newt Gingrich and company and the policies and viewpoints advocated by people like Rush Limbaugh and G. Gordon Liddy. What is missing so far from the American equation is an economic catastrophe. One of the things that disposed the German people to accept the policies of Adolf Hitler was, first of all, the social dislocation produced by the runaway German inflation of the early 1920s. The Deutsche Mark became virtually worthless in the early 20s. They experienced hyperinflation in which literally a wheelbarrow full of paper currency had to be brought to a store to buy a loaf of bread. The German currency became almost worthless. This produced incomparable hardship, or I shouldn't say incomparable, but immense hardship in Weimar Germany. Then the Great Depression itself was even worse in Weimar Germany than it was in the United States. The political dislocation produced by the economic hardship in Germany predisposed people to accepting more violent and radical solutions. They were more disposed towards scapegoating the Jews, for example, for Germany's economic problems, whereas many of the Nazi leaders in their private writings were quite candid about the fact that it was not the Jews who were responsible for Germany's economic problems, but rather it was deemed politically necessary to be able to scapegoat a foreign element, a hostile element, for Germany's problems in order to unify the German people behind the Nazi political agenda. When people like Ronald Reagan and George Bush and Bob Dole and their shills in the media, G. Gordon Liddy and Rush Limbaugh talk about the Democratic Congress and the national debt, remember that it is George Bush and Ronald Reagan who came into power under the banner of fiscal conservatism. Ronald Reagan said, "We've got to hold down government spending." Well, Ronald Reagan was the greatest government spender of all time. The national debt was $900 billion when Jimmy Carter left office. Reagan upped it to over $2.6 trillion. That's a threefold increase of the national debt run up by all of the presidents from George Washington to Jimmy Carter combined. George Bush pushed it up over $4 trillion. And this was not accomplished because of the Democratic Congress. Again, you'll hear Rush Limbaugh say, "This is the Democratic Congress. You know, this fiscal waste is a product of the Democrats and the liberals." Baloney. It was accomplished by Republicans. The Republicans controlled Congress from 1980 through 1986, and they had effective control. They controlled the Senate from 80 through 86, and they had effective control of the Congress because of the so-called boll weevils, conservative Southern Democrats, who allied completely with the Reagan political agenda. And the result of that agenda, to completely analogous, in my opinion, to the corporate state of Mussolini, which failed for the same reasons and in the same manner, this did not spur economic growth in the United States. Rather, it completely reversed America's position in the world as the greatest creditor nation. We were owed more money than any other nation on earth. We had enjoyed that status from the end of World War I through 1980. Reagan and Bush changed that in 12 years. Sooner or later, the economic chickens that were hatched under Reagan and Bush are going to be coming home to roost. Actually, they already are. When you pay taxes, and tax time has just passed, remember that when you pay taxes, 28 cents out of every dollar you pay in taxes goes to finance the debt that was run up by Ronald Reagan and George Bush in 12 years. And it was not run up by Democrats and liberals in Congress, you know, Bill Clinton and these other leftists, as Rush Limbaugh will go on about. It was run up by Ronald Reagan and George Bush and a Republican-controlled Senate and an effectively Republican-controlled House of Representatives with the collaboration of the boll weevils. And what they brought us was not fiscal conservatism. It was not an economic growth. What they brought us was the bankrupting of America. And yet, and this is the thing that I find most disturbing, and yet, Reagan and Bush were able to get away with painting themselves as fiscal conservatives. Bush said, "If we got to hold down wasteful government, wouldn't it be prudent to allow ourselves to continue this wasteful spending?" Reagan, the same thing. "I'm not going to allow big government to spend American people." They were the greatest government spenders of all time. The fact that people didn't rush the podium and hang these sons of bitches in their garters is, to my way of thinking, proof that what they were really saying was well understood. The cry on the part of Ronald Reagan and George Bush to hold down government spending doesn't mean let's spend hundreds of $billions on the military, let's spend $800 for a toilet seat for a P-3 Orion, let's spend $450 for an Allen wrench for the Pentagon. Now that kind of government spending was just fine. The military's budgets in the peak Cold War years exceed the yearly corporate earnings of the entire Fortune 500 combined. And that all comes out of your pocket, folks, or out of something else eventually, perhaps. But the point that I'm making is that when Ronald Reagan or George Bush present themselves as fiscal conservatives, when they make the outrageous statement, you've got to hold down government spending, they're not holding on government spending, but that was well received because it is a well understood code word. It is an explicitly racist battle cry, and it is scapegoating poor people and people of color in particular for America's economic problems. This country's economic problems are not caused by people on welfare any more than they're being caused by, quote, illegal immigrants, unquote. That is not what has caused America's economic problems, and this is very clear to anyone who has any working elementary understanding of economics. However, when Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Richard Nixon, and others say we've got to hold down big government and government spending, it is well understood as meaning that let's get those black people and Mexicans off of welfare. We're spending our hard-earned tax dollars. I want double card every day, and I'm not on welfare. I'd be too yakety, yakety, yak. It is basically, what is significant about this, it is a scapegoating of poor people and people of color in particular, minorities, for America's economic problems. That is what Ronald Reagan and George Bush mean by let's hold down government spending. That's what Rush Limbaugh and G. Gordon Liddy mean. It is a racist code word, and it is a scapegoating, one that has been used effectively. And what scares the bejesus out of me, quite frankly, is that if America's economic problems worsen, and I think they are going to worsen dramatically as a result of the debt run up by Reagan and Bush, it stands to reason that the scapegoating process also will escalate correspondingly. And I think the possibility of, and again, I'm suggesting very strong things here, please bear with me, but fascism and Nazism are very strong things. The possibility of a, quote, final solution to the Negro problem, unquote, or a, quote, final solution to the Mexican problem, unquote, are not something that should be dismissed. Again, the reason I've gone into the history of fascism and the history of Nazism is that the horrors of the Third Reich, the horrors of World War II, the excesses of Auschwitz were not an aberration. They were the direct outgrowth of political, economic, and intellectual trends that were very much present and viewed with great favor by people of influence here in the United States. Fascism and Nazism were not aberrations, and my fear is that in the event of an economic catastrophe in this country, and I think one is coming, I don't know whether it's going to come in 6 months or whether it's going to come in 30 years, I don't know whether it's going to be gradual or precipitous, whether there's going to be a collapse of the stock market like in '29 or perhaps something more gradual, that the social dislocation that will be produced by an economic crisis will drive the dispossessed average American into the arms of an American Hitler. And those Hitlers are around. And I think the ranks of the militias and the ranks of the paramilitary right and the explicitly fascist elements of it. Let me also repeat that in my own experience with the paramilitary right, it's a mixed bag. Many of them are sincere, although generally badly misinformed conservatives, and many of them are outright racists and fascists. I wouldn't want to say what percentage is which. I'm afraid that the only thing missing from the equation which could lead to an American fascism and an American final solution of whatever ethnic group would be scapegoated, the only thing missing is an economic collapse. And I'm afraid that's coming, and I'm afraid that that is very likely to multiply the ranks of the Marxists from Michigan. And so I think that we should take a very, very close look at Oklahoma City as not only perhaps an American Reichstag, but in that so far the investigation has not done well. So far, we have these two low-level hockey pucks, if in fact they were involved with the crime. It would appear that if they did what they were alleged to have done, it was as relatively low-level operatives of more powerful and as yet unrevealed institutions. I suspect probably an element within our own national security establishment deeply sympathetic with the Nazi aims of some of the Nazi and fascist elements of these militias. I also, by way of wrapping up the discussion, will perhaps relate one of the interesting things that is, and interesting as a euphemism here, one of the things that has dominated the American political landscape in the 80s and 90s has been the advent of the militant Christian right wing. Actually, right-wing Christianity is anything but new. And in the pre-World War II period, many domestic American fascist organizations were basically extreme right-wing Christian organizations. An organization like the Christian Mobilizers of Gerald L.K. Smith, who worked directly with Third Reich intelligence to overthrow the government of the United States, who also got funding from Henry Ford, one of Hitler's earliest and most prominent financial backers. Gerald L.K. Smith had his Christian Mobilizers organization. There were other, quote, Christian and, quote, patriotic, unquote, organizations that were openly and avowedly fascist and pro-Nazi. Reinhard Gehlen, the Nazi Eastern Front spy outfit head that I spoke about earlier, again, arguably the most important intelligence officer of the Third Reich, who then jumped to the fledgling CIA with his entire organization, which ultimately wound up as the German intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, a direct evolution forward of the Third Reich's intelligence system. An individual, by the way, who, while ostensibly working for the Americans, was still clearing his orders with General Franz Halder, his chief of staff from the Hitler period, and Admiral Karl von Dönitz, who succeeded Hitler as the head of the German state. While ostensibly a prisoner of war, yet working for CIA and military intelligence, Gehlen was clearing each of his actions with the Third Reich's military leadership, indicating that the German chain of command was still in effect within the Gehlen organization when it was functioning for the CIA. Gehlen, after his formal retirement from the BND, had a very interesting career. He became a religious evangelist. This was a lifelong spook, and Hitler's most important intelligence officer. He became an evangelical Christian after formally retiring from the BND. You don't ever become head of the BND or the CIA or any other major intelligence service and sever your functions to it. You remain connected to it. You may not be the head, but you don't remain unconnected to it. It's also interesting to note that one of the plans that the Nazis had made to survive military defeat was to hook up with American fascists, and one of the groups that they explicitly were hoping to hook up with was right-wing Protestant evangelicals in the United States. It's interesting to contemplate the vengeful and totally un-Christian policies of the Christian right against the background of the Third Reich's contingency plans to survive military defeat, and against the remarkable post-intelligence career of Reinhard Gehlen, Nazi spy chief extraordinaire turned religious evangelist. One wonders whether perhaps the Christian coalition of Pat Robertson might be Foreign Armies West, just as the Gehlen organization was Foreign Armies East for Nazi Germany. We've got a little more time. Why don't we take a short break? I'm going to take a short break because I've been talking ad nauseum, perhaps, again, to sustain the culinary metaphor that I established at the beginning of this talk. Why don't we take a break, and then if people have questions, comments, whatever they would like to add to the discussion, I'd be more than happy to answer them. By the way, this microphone is much too large for hostile questions and hostile suggestions that I have heard before on this topic. Okay, so let's take a break, and then I will answer your questions.
Anytime. All right.
I got a question. Can you discuss the significance with the different departments involved in the federal building that were blown up? Is there any significance between a message that the bombers wanted, that these militia groups wanted to send?
I think so. I think the Waco operation, this gets into some of the more complex speculative elements of what took place. The Waco incident, the storming of the Branch Davidian compound, the liquidation of the Branch Davidians, has outraged, I think it was an outrageous incident, and it has served as that of the Randy Weaver siege, in which a white supremacist was besieged and his wife and son killed by the FBI. Those two incidents have served as focal points for the anger of the paramilitary right and also the related elements within the so-called respectable, unquote, political establishment. I suspect, and this I want to clearly emphasize as speculation, that Waco was intended, I think that was an intelligence operation, and I think it was intended to destabilize the Clinton administration. One of the lessons to be learned from examining the reality of American power politics in the Cold War period, in particular our political assassinations, things like the COINTELPRO program and others, is that the same tactics that have long been used abroad to destabilize countries, to the use of covert actions, coups d'etat, political assassinations, the setting up of death squads, have been done here at home as well. The warrant for the search of the Branch Davidian compound was actually secured by the Bush administration, by the Justice Department of George Bush, which was headed up by William Barr, a quote ex-unquote CIA operative who left the CIA at the same time as Bush resigned. Now that left the directorship of Central Intelligence. The intelligence community has a technique known as sheep dipping. Again, it comes from making the old phrase, the wolf in sheep's clothing. The idea is to formally sever someone with the agency so that they can then be secreted into an undercover assignment while ostensibly not working for the CIA anymore. Who, me? Not me. William Barr was ex-CIA. George Bush had been director of the CIA, and you never become director of CIA and sever your connection to the agency. You know way too much. You retain those connections. In examining the Waco operation, which took place specifically the siege began on February 28th of 1993, the Justice Department officials that were involved with overseeing it were all holdovers from the Justice Department of George Bush, which was headed up by a former CIA officer, and I think former may very well belong in quotes. They were also people who were deeply involved with the Iraqgate scandal, specifically the illegal transfer of arms by the Bush administration to Saddam Hussein, which was effectively covered up. Richard Scruggs, one of the people who oversaw justice at Waco, had been one of the people who covered up the Iraqgate scandal. My reference on that is a stated source as William Safire, conservative columnist for the New York Times. Another was a fellow named Mark Richard, who helped to cover up the Iran-Contra investigation. Mark Richard appears to be an intelligence community fixer within the Department of Justice, of long-standing. Whenever there's an investigation which moves in the direction of the illegal operations of the intelligence community, Mark Richard is mysteriously there to deter that investigation from proceeding as far as it might have. Another fellow that was involved with the Waco situation, although not on the siege itself, was a former Bush Justice Department person named Ed Dennis, who, according to Alan Friedman of the Financial Times of London and William Safire, Financial Times of London is sort of like the Wall Street Journal or Business Week of Great Britain. It's a very respected and very conservative publication. Alan Friedman and of the Financial Times of London, and also William Safire had fingered Ed Dennis as one of the Bush Justice Department officials that helped to stonewall the Iraqgate investigation, in which an Italian commercial bank, the Banca Nazionale del Lavoro, long, by the way, used by the U.S. intelligence community as a vehicle for covert operations, was used to finance the weapons transfers to Saddam Hussein. That was done by people in the Bush administration, by the intelligence community, by William Casey. It is very well documented. It was completely illegal. Some of those weapons were used to kill and maim American servicemen and women in the Persian Gulf War, and yet Bush won. William Safire has suggested a quid pro quo, which I think warrants serious consideration. He called it one hand whitewashing the other. Ed Dennis, the former Bush Justice Department staffer involved in covering up Iraqgate, wrote the report that completely exonerated Janet Reno's Justice Department of any wrongdoing in connection with the Waco situation. Janet Reno's Justice Department completely exonerated the Bush administration of any wrongdoing in connection with Iraqgate. Both are demonstrably wrong. And I suspect the related intelligence control agency networks to combat the terrorist menace, which in fact became a government within a government, literally like a private intelligence agency for George Bush. And operatives for every governmental agency were involved. There were people from Justice, people from FBI. One of the spokespersons for much of the FBI participation in Waco was a guy named Oliver Revelle, who also helped cover up Iran-Contra, and who was part of these intergovernmental agency networks that were working for George Bush in the Iran-Contra scandal, the Iraqgate scandal, and others. My suspicion is, and I want to make it clear this is speculative, is that Waco was an intelligence operation, specifically put together by the intelligence community using people from the Bush administration that had been involved in this totally extra-governmental and illegal operation, which was at the core of the Reagan-Bush White House and national security establishment, to destabilize Bill Clinton. Also, I think, and this again is speculative, that some messages are being sent to Bill Clinton. Several of his key campaign aides died during the campaign under as yet unexplained circumstances. The circumstances surrounding Vince Foster's death argue that it was not suicide but rather murder. I don't think Clinton was involved in the killing, however I suspect he may have been forced into the cover-up. I think it was a message. And interestingly enough, the 4 ATF agents who died in the attack on the Branch Davidian compound had all served as bodyguards to Bill Clinton during his campaign. That's a remarkable coincidence, and I suspect a message was being sent. There's a right-wing investigator named Linda Thompson. I think some of what she says is accurate. I think a lot of it is nonsense. I mean, she talks about Bill Clinton as a leftist and a communist and calling for his overthrow. I mean, Bill Clinton ain't no leftist, folks. And Bill Clinton is a Southern Democrat. He's quite conservative. One of the problems in this country is the whole political spectrum has been shifted so far to the right that, for example, Barry Goldwater, who was viewed as an ultra-right-wing extremist in 1964, I mean, he was viewed as a complete wacko. Now, he is well to the left of the Republican Party as a whole, and that is scary stuff. I suspect that a message was being sent to Bill Clinton with Waco. I also expect that, I should say that this was an intelligence operation which may have been intended to foment, at one level, to foment the very discord that we're seeing right now. When our national security establishment decides to move in any given direction, they move in that direction. When to do so, we'll scratch a number of different itches at different strategic levels simultaneously. With the Waco operation, it made Bill Clinton look bad. It helped to get Kay Bailey Hutchinson elected as the Republican senator from Texas to the senatorial seat previously held by Lloyd Benson, who had been the Secretary of the Treasury for Bill Clinton. It also got people to a certain extent, I think, accustomed to the idea of martial law. And again, those martial law contingency plans were put on the books by Oliver North and George Bush, and as a result of recommendations coming out of the Vice President's task force to combat terrorism. Those recommendations led to the formation of these interagency government networks that were used for Iran-Contra, for Iraqgate, and which developed contingency plans to place the United States under martial law and to suspend the Constitution in the event of any one of a number of possibilities, including a major terrorist incident, like the Reichstag fire provocation that Hitler used. Also, there are a number of interesting things about Waco as well. The role played in that situation by a Florida-based arms dealer named Henry McMahon, I think, warrants scrutiny. There is an inextricable connection between the arms trafficking industry and the intelligence community, although they're by no means coterminous. And indeed, Florida is one of the epicenters, one of the geographical epicenters of the intelligence community and arms trafficking milieu. And this guy McMahon moved from Florida to nearby Hewitt, Texas, became a member of the cult, bought most of the weapons that the cult had, was recruiting people into the cult, and then a month and a half before the siege began, he moved back to Florida, so he got away. One cannot draw a conclusion from that, but when one is dealing with the intelligence community, and I think that is probably the case at Waco, you're dealing with things that are not conducted openly, and I have a hunch, and again, this is speculation. I want to emphasize that, I want to distinguish that as opposed to many of the other things that I've said, which are established fact, albeit things that will strike people as nuts. I suspect that Henry McMahon was functioning on behalf of the intelligence community and in basically an agent provocateur role. I think the Branch Davidians themselves gave serious indications of being perhaps a government mind control experimentation program. A lot of cults have been used for that. The People's Temple of Jim Jones was such a cult. That was an intelligence front used for using human guinea pigs for various kinds of mind control experiments by our intelligence services. It was also used to recruit Angolan mercenaries to fight on behalf of the CIA in Angola, and also to control the government of Forbes Burnham for the CIA. The other cults have given similar indications. I have a lot of questions about this Aum Shinrikyo group in Japan. It's a very, very interesting group, which appears to have capabilities far beyond what what one would attribute to a religious cult. Millions and millions of dollars, technical expertise far beyond that would be expected for a private organization. They had a shopping list of advanced military equipment that they were going to buy from Russia that included submarines, for God's sake. That's quite a thing for a cult to be purchasing. You know, buy a few submarines. Also, the operation of those things is illegal. You can't buy a military submarine and then operate it on the high seas under maritime convention. You can't. That's a warship, and it cannot be operated privately. You get a military submarine and start sailing out around. That's an act of piracy in and of itself. You are a pirate according to international law. Unless you work for a country, that's fine. But private citizens can't operate a military submarine, even if you have the capabilities of doing so. But I think the interesting thing about the Aum Shinrikyo cult is it has active duty members within the Japanese military. It also has former military members that were reportedly being recruited into a fighting cell. I have speculated about connections between that and Oklahoma City. The same day that Oklahoma City went down, there was another gas attack in a Japanese subway. And then a couple of Aum Shinrikyo members were supposedly infiltrating into the United States to launch a gas attack on Disneyland. This was one of the justifications for taking the shackles off the PDID. And there are a number of other interesting aspects of Aum Shinrikyo, which I think is being used to destabilize Japan and to push it in the direction of fascism and a police state. Interestingly enough, it hasn't received a lot of discussion. This Shoko Asahara, the guru, he admires Adolf Hitler. That isn't a mystical or religious concept. That's altogether political, ladies and gentlemen. You know, you have some head of a powerful clandestine organization who admires Adolf Hitler and launches terrorist attacks using a Nazi nerve gas, sarin, developed by I.G. Farben for Hitler during World War II. And then they allegedly try to assassinate the chief of police. The head of the science division of this group, who allegedly oversaw the production of sarin, is conveniently assassinated as is being led in by the Japanese police to be arrested, a la Lee Harvey Oswald by Jack Ruby, even though this guy was hanging around for 9 hours and didn't attack any of the other Aum Shinrikyo leaders who were brought into the same station. And some very interesting questions, I think, about the Aum Shinrikyo situation and the effect they're having on Japan. Japanese democracy, I didn't have time to go into this on the tape, but the Japanese democracy was subverted in the 1920s and 30s by organizations that were called the patriotic or ultra-nationalist societies. These were organizations that were run by the imperial general staff officers. They were a combination of military intelligence fronts, religious cults, and organized crime syndicates. They engage in various types of contraband smuggling. I've also noted certain similarities between Aum Shinrikyo and some of the things that are cropping up in connection with the McVeigh situation. These organizations were used to systematically assassinate the democratic political leadership of Japan and pave the way for the rise of the Japanese militarists in the 1930s. Interestingly enough, there's a number of similarities between Aum Shinrikyo and things that are going on in this country. Again, there was a terrorist incident, there was another gas attack in the Japanese subway the same day as Oklahoma City happened. A couple of those people were headed to Disneyland, supposedly to attack Disneyland. Aum Shinrikyo was reportedly manufacturing methamphetamine to help finance their operations. So was John McVeigh, according to a number of accounts. I think there are a number of methamphetamine production, weapons trafficking is also cropping up in connection with Aum Shinrikyo, and the guns and drug trade, which are often reciprocal, are used to finance various types of activity on behalf of fascist groups and also the intelligence community, and there's an area of overlap. I think that there may very well be some hard connections between Aum Shinrikyo and the situation in Waco, or the situation in Oklahoma City. Now, many of the people from Oklahoma City's federal building, such as the ATF contingent and FBI contingents, were deeply involved with Waco. So I think the significance of that date was well understood to the paramilitary right wing. But I think that Waco was originally instituted as an intelligence operation by the Bush-Reagan faction of the national security establishment to destabilize and discredit Bill Clinton and to pave the way for basically an open, broad-based, right-wing fascist revolution in this country.
First of all, we're trying to find out right now because we need your signature and social security number in order to get paid. Marshall just ran over to find out if you can bring that stuff here.
I hope so.
If not, we got to run out of here in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Get that taken care of.
Sounds good.
But the question I have for you is really one question and then a comment. To what extent would you attribute the pointing the finger at Islamic fundamentalism and Arabs as an act of racism and ignorance versus some sort of deliberate misdirection? And
I think a little of both. I think that the World Trade Center bombing also may very well have been a provocation, although Middle Eastern terrorists and Islamic fundamentalists were apparently the operational elements in that, as well as, interestingly enough, an alleged plot to blow up commuter thoroughfares, to attack commuter thoroughfares and blow up landmarks and commit assassinations in New York City, where, by the way, there is also a branch of the Shinrikyo cult right now. That was going on, that trial in which Sheikh Rahman and his milieu were accused of conspiring to attack commuter thoroughfares, that was ongoing as the Shinrikyo situation took place in Japan. I wondered on my program to what extent a psychological principle known as stimulus generalization may have been employed. Our intelligence services use psychology. In fact, Alan Dulles felt that psychology and the application of it was the single most important element in devising effective intelligence operations and effective political control of the American people. I wondered whether stimulus generalization might have been employed. That, to make a long story short, in behavioral psychology, if you train like a white rat, say, to press a lever to get a food pellet when an orange light is flashed, a red light or a dark yellow light will also elicit some of the same responses, but the farther you get away from the conditioned stimulus, like say a green light or a blue light, doesn't bring out the conditioned response to as nearly as great a frequency. And I wondered to what extent people were made to generalize, to think about what was happening with Sheikh Rahman, and then think about what was happening in Japan, where they were attacking commuter thoroughfares, and then generalize back to the United States. But Sheikh Rahman and his milieu worked for U.S. intelligence in Afghanistan. And in fact, Sheikh Rahman was brought into the United States by the CIA and kept here by CIA and NSA because of his recruiting efforts in order to recruit Islamic fundamentalists to fight on behalf of the Afghan Mujahideen against the former Soviet Union. And those recruiting efforts were also conducted, to a large extent, by some of the interagency governmental networks that were set up by pursuant to the recommendations coming out of the Vice President's task force, the Vice President being George Bush. So I think that the discussion of Islamic fundamentalists was, on the one hand, racist and misdirection, also perhaps meant to get people to psychologically generalize to the situation of Sheikh Rahman.
Brian, I don't need that until tomorrow.
What's that?
That doesn't need to be done until tomorrow.
They don't need this till tomorrow. Okay, then we'll have to do this after.
Okay.
But they wanted it back tonight.
So, I hope that answered the question. Certainly, I think that the knee-jerk response of, well, this has got to be Islamic fundamentalists, was in and of itself racist. There certainly has been plenty of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, but one of the interesting things is that an awful lot of that is connected to elements of our own intelligence system and also the Germans' intelligence systems. There's widespread collaboration now between BND, the successor of the Reinhard Gehlen Nazi Eastern Front spy outfit, and Iranian Islamic fundamentalists, and also some of the terrorists who were trained by Saddam Hussein and others. This is documented. So a lot of these, quote, Islamic, unquote, terrorists, and, quote, Arabic, or, quote, Middle Eastern terrorists, unquote, are in fact working on behalf of our intelligence system and elements connected with it.
I don't want to monopolize here, but it seems like we do have plenty of time now.
I don't want to drag it on too long, because my voice will start getting tired. I got a busy weekend ahead of me.
Related to that question was the idea, you elicited a couple of reasons why it appeared to be an intelligence operation, the Oklahoma situation. And I'm wondering if maybe an additional one that you didn't cover, perhaps you did and it just blew right by me, but the amount of stories that appear to already be set up, it seems like they had background research. I remember there was one character, I can't remember who he was or where he came from, but he was talking about having evidence linking Islamic fundamentalist groups to that act. And then as soon as everything was being pointed at the militias, this guy just dropped out of sight.
Yeah, I do think that there are indications that this thing was crafted in advance. Again, Army Times commented on the remarkable degree of interagency cooperation that was brought to bear on the situation in Oklahoma City. Like one spokesperson said, it's like they knew it was going to happen in advance, unquote. Actually said that in so many words. And the way in which the media functioned, which I think the function of the media in connection with Oklahoma City has been proto-fascistic. I mean, immediately we were told, well, we're going to all have to give up our freedoms in order to combat the terrorism. And I said, hold it, give up my freedom. You give up your freedoms, I'm keeping mine, because I think that in order to combat the terrorist menace, as Walt Kelly, the cartoonist who used to draw the Pogo comics, we have met the enemy and he is us. You know? So that I'm not going to give up my civil liberties in order to combat an enemy that I think is being deliberately set up to do this very thing in order to eliminate my civil liberties. So, and just there are a lot of indications that this goes much beyond, far beyond Big Bay and company. In fact, I even warned on my program at one point, because I have a lot of right-wingers that listen to the show, and that there are a fair number of people in the paramilitary right, and even my opposition to gun control and my discussion of an apparent intelligence community connection to the gun control movement, and evaluating that against the background of America's economic situation, the possibility of an economic collapse, and the imposition of martial law. I view all of those as possibly connected. Won the hearts and minds of some of the elements of the right who assume that I must be a right-winger to be arguing against gun control. So a lot of them listen to my show. Also, the Silicon Valley, where I do my show, is a large reactionary population. But I know from some of the questions and answers, some of my phone-in sessions, that I do have a fair number of those people listening. I warned them on the air. I said, you know, you people, because a lot of them, there were two all phone-in shows that I did in July of last year. They were the most boring programs I've ever had. It was all these right-wing conspiracy theorists asking me about a lot of real wacko stuff. You know, do I think the Freemasons were taking things over? And you know, didn't I think this? And trying to advance the theory that the United Nations was going to gain control of the United States using Russian troops. I mean, first of all, that makes the rather airy assumption that the United Nations wants to gain control of the United States. And I'll toss the gauntlet down to anybody, show me any concrete evidence. It also makes a rather airy assumption that Russian soldiers would want to take over the United States, and I toss the gauntlet down to anybody to show me that they do. I'm sure there might be a few embittered general staff or KGB officers who'd like to see the United States brought low, but trying to use Russian troops to do it is just so utterly asinine. And the notion of, I mean, the Russians can't even handle Chechnya, and the UN can't handle Bosnia or Somalia. So how the hell are the two combined going to handle the United States? Bloody unlikely, although there have been questionnaires circulated in the military, and even some edicts that have gone out, basically subjugating American officers to UN command when used on UN peacekeeping missions. That isn't going to take place in the heartland of the United States. There has been a lot of importation of Soviet-made arms, which are now available incredibly cheap. In fact, a mainstream European publication, actually it's about Europe, but it's published in the United States. Actually, it's global. But it was talking about, there was a sales guy who was hustling MiG-29 combat aircraft for $8 million. That's a top-line tactical combat aircraft. Getting a hold of a state-of-the-art combat aircraft for $8 million is a steal. I read that, and I proposed that what we ought to do to cut our budgets is to equip our Air Force with MiG-29s, which we'd buy from the Russians for $8 million each. You price an F-16 now to F-22. I mean, it's just a couple of $1 billion per plane. $8 million for a good tactical combat aircraft is a bargain and a half. I'm serious. And of course, you'd never be able to propose this, but hell, if they're offering MiG-29s for $8 million, we ought to be buying up all those MiG-29s and using those instead of spending $3 billion for the new, stealth flying turkey or whatever built by Northrop or whatever crooked manufacturer's going to be gouging the taxpayer in this country. But the Russian arms are available very cheap because the Soviet Union is bankrupt and it's a fire sale. And the intelligence community is inextricably connected with the arms trafficking community. And it makes all the sense in the world to me that they would be buying up large amounts of former Soviet weaponry because a lot of countries' militaries use former Soviet weaponry. Countries in Africa, for example, the former Warsaw Pact countries use Soviet military equipment. And from a practical standpoint, when you're engaged in arms trafficking, and the reason why the world of arms trafficking and one of the reasons why the world of arms trafficking and the world of the intelligence community overlap to such a large extent, first of all, when you're engaged in a covert operation, you've got to get weapons from point A to point B clandestinely. That's part of it. Also, say you want to overthrow a country's government, you begin selling them weapons in which you're doing deals and having your people liaise with their general staff officers. You are establishing a very significant sphere of influence within that country. When you have clout within the general staff officers of a given country's military, you're in a position to certainly influence, if not ultimately overthrow, that government. And that's why stockpiling large amounts of Russian arms makes all the sense in the world. It is a vehicle that can be used as a lever of influence in various countries whose military establishments use equipment manufactured by the former Soviet Union. So I have some colleagues with military and intelligence backgrounds who verify that large amounts of that equipment are being purchased and brought into the United States. Some of the sightings of some of these trains carrying Russian tanks or APCs or something like that have been cited by the wackos on the far right as saying, this is it, this is proof, you know, the United Nations is going to be taking what Limbaugh has never come out with that, but it's proof that the UN was going to take over the United States using Russian troops. Well, that's a crock. It does make all the sense in the world to be buying up their weapons. That's so we can basically wheedle our way into wherever Russian weapons are being used and influence the countries, make money, because these things are available cheap, and we won't be reselling them as cheap as they're going to be available. I guarantee you, if our military buys a MiG-29 for $8 million, they're not going to resell it to you for $8,100,000. They're going to resell it to you for a whole lot more. And I wish it was a jet fighter pilot. That sounds like a great deal. They come up with $8 million to buy a MiG-29, you know, cherry it up. But anyway, so we were talking about how do we even get on the subject of Russian arms? Yeah, question.
Well, you mentioned the Kennedy assassination a little while ago. I wonder if you could just give 5 minutes of your own.
Oh, wow. It would take 5 hours to do it justice. It was a covert operation, one which, in my opinion, had been planned as a contingency plan even before Kennedy was elected. The milieu, the fascist political and national security milieu that accomplished it, with these Third Reich intelligence imports at its core, because those were the people that were handling the Oswalds in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. You take a look at who the supposed Marxist Lee Harvey Oswald, who didn't kill anybody, Kennedy least of all. You couldn't hit Oswald couldn't hit the broadside of the barn. He was a lousy shot. He barely stayed in the Marines. And the circumstances surrounding his behavior of the Marines, his severance from the Marines, his travel to Europe, his defection from the Soviet Union are so corny. I mean, this guy was traveling all over with no money and able to pay for tickets and boat and plane fare to various places without having the money in his bank account. He supposedly defected to the Soviet Union with top secret information about America's radar nets and the U-2 spy plane. Then returned to the United States, was never prosecuted for a crime. You try that. Suppose I mean, this is the early 60s, and I don't know if how effectively you're able to remember the political climate of that time, but let's just say that someone who had been suspected of, let alone convicted of, someone who was alleged to have spied for the Soviet Union against the United States was not going to be let back in the United States without being interned or even interrogated by the CIA or FBI. Instead, he was met by Spazregan, affiliated with the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, a consortium of Eastern European fascist organizations, which was essentially the reconstitution of the Committee of Subjugating Nations put together by Adolf Hitler in 1943. Then this supposed Marxist and supposed traitor to the United States immediately he gets a job in New Orleans with Jaggers Child Stovall, which does classified work for the U.S. Army, right? I mean, to give him another chance to spy on us against the Soviet Union, this is how it's done all the time. Then begins hanging around with, espousing a pro-Castro stance, hanging around with anti-Castro Cubans, aerospace. This guy was also supposedly a per diem warehouse worker with a 10th grade education, working for the minimum wage. He's hanging around with petroleum industry high rollers, defense industry high rollers, virulently anti-communist white Russians with espionage backgrounds dating back to the Third Reich. Not bloody likely. Not bloody likely at all. And then he supposedly commits this crime and is conveniently off before he can defend himself. At the core of the Kennedy assassination milieu was a fascist milieu involving domestic and American fascists. For example, George Lincoln Rockwell, the Führer of the American Nazi parties, Arlington, Virginia name and address were found in Oswald, and phone number unlisted were found in Oswald's address book. at the time of his arrest, as were those of people like William Potter Gale, the head of the California militia at one point, deeply connected with this Patriots movement. Nobody ever asked what a documentary communist or Marxist was doing with those people's names and addresses in his address book, or what the hell he was doing keeping the kind of company he was keeping, or moving around the areas he was moving around. The core of the conspiracy was this it was a milieu combining domestic and imported, as I said earlier, it's like beer, domestic and imported American fascists. But at the operational level, it appears to have been the Galen spy outfit and related elements. They certainly were handling the Oswalds when they got to the United States and trafficking them around and helping Lee to get established in various places. Probably the main national security connection was the MacArthur group within the military. Douglas MacArthur had a lot of overtly fascist staff officers who worked for him, including his intelligence chief, his G2, from 1939 to the Korean War period. There was a guy I explained earlier, a German-born fascist named Karl Adolf von Zeppelin-Biedenbach, who changed his name to Charles Willoughby. He was an ardent admirer of Francisco Franco, the fascist dictator of Spain, to whom he became an advisor after retiring as MacArthur's G2. This guy was very close to the Galen organization, in touch with the old Odessa network in Spain. And again, this was the guy who was in charge of MacArthur's military intelligence from 1939 through the Korean War period. And a lot of other officers on MacArthur's staff had overtly fascist connections. And they in turn became very close to the Hunt family in Texas, who in turn were very close to this Eastern European and Nazi fascist emigre group. In fact, it appears that H.L. Hunt may have helped to bankroll a private, quote-unquote, network of these white Russians called the Nightingale Network, which was aimed at restoring the Tsar and/or fascism to Soviet Union or parts of it. They eventually did go to work for U.S. intelligence, but they were initially sponsored by an unidentified American right-wing oilman, probably H.L. Hunt. They eventually did agree to go to work for CIA, whom they considered to be, very liberal. They considered the CIA to be sort of leftist and quite tainted, which will give you an idea of just how far to the right these people were. The Nightingales were probably being sustained by H.L. Hunt and the Hunt family. That family was deeply connected with the Eastern European fascist and Nazi emigre group. They also were very, very closely connected and deeply connected to domestic American fascists as well, running from the John Birch Society types on through your Minutemen, paramilitary types. They also had connections with other major American capital, not just right-wing Southern Rim oil interests, but people like the Rockefellers, the Murchisons, and capital interests which are viewed as more respectable and more mainstream. The evidence disproving the Warren Report is overwhelming. I mean, the Warren Report is not just wrong, it's physically impossible in all of its major manifestations. It's an absolute crock of you-know-what, from A to Z. There's no aspect of it which even makes sense, let alone is correct. In fact, the 26 volumes of testimony and exhibits upon which the Warren Commission, the Warren Report, is supposedly based, totally disproves the Warren Report itself. In an executive meeting in January of 1964, the Warren Commission was debating whether or not to make the testimony and exhibits upon which their report was supposedly based public, because they knew that it would destroy the report. And when Allen Dulles, again, former director of the CIA, fired by John Kennedy for lying to him about the Bay of Pigs, Allen Dulles, as a member of the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, collaborated deeply with the Third Reich, committed treason against the United States, helped to channel oil to the Third Reich from American oil firms during the war, and helped to launder the Nazi money after World War II and channel it back into West Germany, where it fueled the so-called economic miracle of German economic recovery. Allen Dulles served on the Warren Commission, which covered up John Kennedy's death, and he commented at one point, they were debating whether or not to release the exhibits. He said, people don't read anymore. Don't think people read. A few professors will read the record. Most people will read very little. What he then went on to say was that if you don't publish the 26 volumes of exhibits, people will accuse you of a cover-up. What he said is, go ahead and publish them, but don't index them, and nobody will read it, and you'll be home free. That's what they did. They published 26 volumes of unindexed legal transcription, with, and again, no index. So nobody's read it, and nobody, except for a handful of weirdos, like myself and some of the other researchers, quote, conspiracy theorists, realize that the 26 volumes of Warren Commission testimony and exhibits published by the U.S. Government Printing Office in 1964 destroy the Warren Report completely. Because Dulles was right. He said, people don't read anymore. People watch television. Publish the 26 volumes, don't index it. Nobody will read it except for a few weirdos. We can discredit them and it'll be home free, and that's exactly what happened. It's scary and surprising how much is known about what happened in Dallas. And when you take a look at the composition of the people who were on the Warren Report, it involves people on the Warren Commission, people who intersect with this same milieu. In addition to Alan Dulles, you have John J. McCloy, former U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, who saw to it that many of the top Nazi war criminals were not only not prosecuted, but were put in the service of U.S. intelligence. In fact, one SS Brigadier General named Franz Alfred Sieks, who was in the defendant's dock in Nuremberg for having run Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the German frontline troops into the former Soviet Union and began immediately committing the atrocities that the Nazis committed. He was actually in the defendant's dock in Nuremberg. He was released by John J. McCloy, where he was then put to work forming the Special Forces, which originally were put together for the CIA, and then became part of the regular army. John J. McCloy was also chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank, which actively collaborated with Hitler. John J. McCloy was a personal guest of Adolf Hitler at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin and sat in Hitler's box. He was another member of the Warren Commission. J. Edgar Hoover, as head of the FBI, was not on the commission, but it was inextricably linked with its investigation. Some of the other people, Gerald Ford, who went on to become president, House Minority Leader. When you look at the people who were put together on the Warren Commission, almost all of them were reactionaries. Then they were investigating the murder of a liberal president because Earl Warren himself had a reputation as a liberal. The Warren Commission has usually been portrayed as a liberal body. Not so at all. In fact, most of the members, like John Sherman Cooper, a reactionary Republican from Kentucky who served in the Nixon administration. Hale Boggs of Louisiana, an arch-conservative who eventually, however, came to doubt the results of the Warren Report, began saying publicly that he thought they'd been lied to about the FBI and the CIA. He then began publicly criticizing J. Edgar Hoover's FBI for the COINTELPRO program in the early 70s, and then disappeared while on a private plane trip in the state of Alaska. His plane was never found, and they don't know what happened to him. Which is interesting because if they speculated that the plane flew so low that it was not visible on the radar nets. Well, there's no reason for a plane to fly that low unless it's trying to evade radar, and there's no reason for his plane to do it. Also, if you know anything about Alaska, that is an area where the military maintains a very high degree of surveillance. That's where the electronic warning networks, warning of a possible attack on the Soviet Union are based. And the Navy and the Air Force and Coast Guard engaged in a 39-day search and couldn't find the wreckage of Hale Boggs' plane. They don't know where it wound up. Well, that's BS. Interestingly, Hale Boggs' daughter, Cokie Roberts, the commentator for ABC News, has stated publicly she won't watch the movie JFK because her father was on the Warren Commission, and anything which criticizes the Warren Commission, she won't watch. You talk about somebody who hasn't done her homework. I mean, her own father eventually criticized or voiced extreme public doubts about the veracity of the investigation he participated in, and was in all probability killed for his temerity. And here she won't even see the movie because her father was a member of the commission, so therefore she's not going to see a movie about a conspiracy behind Kennedy's assassination. And again, the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigation, even though it was badly curtailed, badly limited, was forced to recognize that there was a 95% probability of a conspiracy behind John F. Kennedy's assassination. In fact, it was 100%. One of the recommendations they made, and this was a U.S. Congressional Select Committee, they recommended to the U.S. Department of Justice that they begin an investigation of the anti-Castro Cubans and David Ferrie in New Orleans. That was who Jim Garrison was after. But of course, David Ferrie died under strange circumstances shortly after Garrison indicted him. David Ferrie was, as a matter of public record, connected to the CIA, was involved in the CIA's anti-Castro Cuban efforts. The man he identified as his control for CIA, Eladio Del Valle, was found shot, tortured, and macheted to death a few hours after David Ferry's body was discovered. Garrison's chief prosecutorial witness was scheduled to testify on, I think it was February 18th of 1969. He was savagely beaten